Excellent. Send that guy down there. Great. Well, my name is Jordy Izzard, and I'm a SAIS Alumni Relations Officer, and I'm here today on Tuesday, May 29th, 2012, with a family of 3 generations from SAIS. They are all graduates, and I'll start with, on the left here, Sharon Wood Mason, who graduated with a Bologna certificate in 1970, and her MA from SAIS, Washington, D.C. in 1971. To her left is Dana Mason Goodson, who went to Bologna and received an MA-IA after 2 years in 2003. Then to her left is Richard S. Mason, who received his SAIS MA in 1948. And then to his left we have David S. Mason, who also, like his wife Sharon, received a received a certificate from the Bologna class of 1970, and then went on to SAIS Washington, D.C. and received his MA in 1971. So thank you so much for being with me today, and we're just going to have kind of a conversation, and why don't we just start with what originally brought each of you to SAIS, and anybody can kind of jump in.
My dad was a friend of Christian Herder, who was one of the founders of the school. I was thinking about going to Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, and my dad said, there's a new school down in Washington, D.C. that Christian Herder helped form. Maybe you'd be interested in that. So I applied, and
here you are, and there you were. That's great. And then what about others? What brought you all to SAIS?
Well, kind of when we were finishing up in college was the height of the Vietnam War, and we still the Cold War and lots of things going on, and international relations just seemed to me to kind of be the place to be. And I'd already spent 6 months in Italy previously, so I was really interested in the Bologna Center, and got accepted there. And was hoping at that time that I'd get a chance then to go to Russia, and was at least tentatively looking at perhaps doing something in foreign service, but really didn't know, but knew that I wanted to do things in international relations, or thought that's where I was headed at that point.
Great.
Yeah.
And anybody else?
And in my case, Sharon was at Stanford as an undergraduate. I was at Cornell, and I had also spent a year overseas in Munich as an undergraduate. And I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do after I graduated from Cornell, but I knew my father had this experience with SAIS. The Bologna Center was a very attractive idea to spend another year in Italy or in Europe. So I wasn't actually too sure what I was going to do after I graduated, but when I got accepted for the Bologna Center, well, let's go there.
Yeah.
And it turned out to be pretty fortuitous, because that's where I met Sharon.
Excellent. And how about you, Dana?
Well, I was certainly inspired by the rest of the family. And after I graduated from Williams College in '97, and I got a Fulbright teaching assistantship to teach in France. So at the time I graduated as an English major. And when I went to France and spent some time there, I kind of decided I actually really wanted to switch to international relations. So I did. I actually first went to a French international relations school, and then applied to SAIS, and then decided to go on and get the degree there.
Terrific. Well, now that we're at SAIS and kind of going back in history, talk to me a little bit about what your memories of being at SAIS are. And anybody, again, can jump in.
well, I had the good fortune to start in the summertime when the summer session was at Peterborough, New Hampshire. And that was a great experience. It was very informal. And you got to know the people like Sigrid Paynes and Phil Thayer. And my wife was pregnant at the time, and Priscilla Mason was so nice to her and me. And then when it went to Washington, it was just about the time that David was born, and I thought the professors were wonderful. Seagrove Haynes was the best lecturer I think I've ever heard.
Mm-hmm.
I used to write down just about everything he said,
Mm-hmm.
and kept his notebooks for about 50 years. And then we had a great Russian teacher, Madame Tumanov, who had been a jurist and a nurse in Russia, and she motivated me to improve my Russian and studied it hard, which I did. And then there was Willis Armstrong, who taught the Soviet studies, and I had a great relationship with him. And when I had finished SAIS, he recommended me to a lieutenant colonel in the CIA. I went to the lieutenant colonel and they hired me.
Oh, terrific.
But I enjoyed all the classes at SAIS. They were very stimulating.
Mm-hmm. Incidentally, Priscilla Mason, passed away. I don't know if you knew that. We just had her memorial service last week.
Really?
So yeah,
So-
it was a lovely service. Yeah, because
I'm sorry I couldn't have come a week earlier to attend that, and then SAIS graduation was the 24th.
right after that, exactly. Yeah. What about others? What are your memories of SAIS or Bologna?
Yeah, well, I guess the first memories, of course, are of Bologna and getting there and trying to find housing and so on, and then ended up I had 3 roommates, and we ended up having sort of more or less the party place. Two of my roommates, Cindy Prusing of Sonstoli now, and Judy Bell Krutke, and then Margaret Piton. Judy and Cindy were great party organizers, so that, and with 4 of us, we had a big apartment, so we really were kind of the place where everybody would come and for parties that weren't actually the school parties and so on.
It seemed to work out well for you.
It did,
Yeah.
it did, yes. Well, and he had a similar arrangement way on the other side of town. And the other thing I remember is that at that particular time there were a lot of sit-down strikes in Italy that year, which meant that a lot of times the buses didn't run. And I remember, Dave would have a long walk back from our place to his place at night with no buses.
And I spent a lot of time at their place.
Or a lot of time running for buses when they were actually running. But I remember that what was it? Pierre Hasner was was a professor that I really remember and taking his courses, and then he was still there when Dana was there.
Well, yeah, I think we need to tell that story about Pierre Esner and the exam.
I took the course, and it was a political
Philosophy.
Yeah, political philosophy course, and he was very intriguing man, and just had your mind going in all directions and all different ways of looking at issues and problems and so on. So Dave and I had a couple of courses together. We were the only 2 people in the Russian class because we both had Russian before, so we were the only 2 in that particular class. But he didn't take that class.
The Hasner
class he didn't take, but he took the exam.
Well,
So I went
why?
in.
You're going to say
I
why?
can't remember why did I take that?
Well, I was telling him about the class, and I can do that.
So I went in.
You said I don't need to take the class to take the exam.
Yeah. So I went in and took the final exam, and he didn't. I don't think
He
was
wasn't
He
there.
wasn't
Somebody
there.
proctored, or he would
So
know.
I did the whole exam, and I signed it Publius. And turned out Publius got an A.
Fortunately, I did too, or there would have been trouble.
But there was, I remember Hasner, he was trying to find out who Publius was, and he said at first that he wasn't going to tell the grade until Publius fessed up to who he was, who he or she was. And I never fessed up, but he eventually sort of revealed that it was a good grade.
And I told Professor Asner this story
So
much
this is
later.
25 years later, right?
I had him as a professor, actually both at Sciences Po at the Institut d'études politiques in Paris, and then later at Bologna. And I told him this story, and he laughed, but he said he didn't. It was too long ago. He didn't remember.
He didn't remember who Publius was.
He didn't remember about Publius. I was like, it was my dad.
But isn't that something that Dana ended up having the same professor a generation
Absolutely.
later, and not just in Bologna, but also in Paris.
Well, and the other connection was with Seagrove Haynes was in Bologna when we were there.
He was the director of the Bologna Center when we
Yeah.
first arrived, but I think it was only that year maybe.
Yeah.
He started the, I think, Bologna Center in something like in the mid-1950s, I want to say.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think he finished about the time that we were, right after we finished there. But we met Seagrove Haynes when we were, I think the first time was at one of those rooftop parties at the Bologna Center.
He was a great party guy.
Well,
You won the Seagrove Haynes Award.
Yeah, so I would say that's the other connection is for the MAI thesis that I wrote. I got the prize, the Seagrove
That's
Haynes
excellent.
prize.
Yeah.
So.
That's great. And actually, the gentleman that took over right after him, I don't know if you know his name, but Simone Serfati.
Yeah.
I just interviewed him about 3 weeks ago, and he lives about 3 blocks north of SAIS right now.
Really?
Yeah, so that was neat. So anyway, any other memories or?
Well, I mean, the one, I mean, Sharon mentioned sort of in passing, but for me, the main memory is meeting Sharon, meeting my wife, and that we met in this, as she said, a Russian class where it was taught by a young Czech student, Czechoslovak, I guess in those days, Fedor Pichut, who was he was a graduate student at SAIS, but was teaching Russian to pick up some extra money, I guess. So we, at one point in one of these little Russian dialogue classes, just the three of us, he told me to, David, how do you say, would you like to go to the theater would you like to go on a date with me? So it's, try it on Sharon. Would you like to go to a date with me?
He wouldn't do it.
She finally
so
said,
you had to get someone else to ask her?
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah.
So she finally said yes, so we went on a date, and that was the beginning.
Yeah.
And the thing I also remember, it was just, that whole year was just so wonderful. I mean, what better way to spend a year when you're 22, or, Bologna, Italy, which is such a wonderful city, and this fantastic academic program. And Pop mentioned all these wonderful professors, but, you mentioned Hausmayer, but we also had Karl Kaiser that year. I had Paolo Calcini, who was a professor at the University of Bologna who taught East European studies. I took his course in East Europe, and that's what got me interested in that field, which has become my profession. I'm a retired professor of political science, and my specialty was Eastern Europe. So all that stuff was wonderful, but the European Communities trip over the holidays was one of the highlights when, in those days, SAIS heavily subsidized it. We had to pay anything, and we went to Paris for NATO, we went to Bruges for the European University, we went to Brussels.
Yeah, we went to Switzerland. And you and I had gone in England. What was that program there?
There was a NATO simulation program in England
Just
that we went to.
Fantastic programs.
But it was during the European Communities trip, when we were in Paris, that I proposed to Sharon. So, this is just a few months after we met, but proposed to her there, she accepted. This time, she accepted right away. And then we were married the next summer after we got back from Bologna.
Terrific. And what about Washington? Any memories? I know you were just in Bologna, Dana. But do you have memories?
I don't have any Washington story. I mean, I guess Bologna, the thing that kind of comes to mind is actually I had just started, we were in the SAIS pre-session on September 11th, 2001.
Oh, wow.
So that's like a really strong memory for me is, being with the SAIS community at that time, and it was just very powerful moments, obviously, and and sort of being with our quite a close group of friends and kind of sharing that time together. And then also, kind of the funny part of it is that after that was like there was a carabinieri. They stationed like policemen outside SAIS for like the entire year, I think even longer, which was just, it was, they were kind of not very serious, so that everybody sort of laughed about the carbonary protecting SAIS, but that was sort of a reminder of it the whole time that we were there.
When did you go to Columbia?
And so that was the other thing I would have mentioned. Actually, it was my second year when I was doing my MAI thesis. I studied Columbia, the peace communities in Columbia, and I had some really great professors who were helping me with the thesis. Francisco Gonzalez, who I believe is still there.
He actually just won the teaching award.
Yeah,
Wow.
he's great.
Yeah.
Sure totally deserves that. And Harold Muller, who I don't know if he's German, and he would come, do the weekend classes. He'd come and teach I think it's every other week or so. They would come for several days and teach. And so the two of them were my readers for my thesis. And but I did take a trip to Columbia to do some research and went out and some of the villages, the peace communities in the northwest corner of Columbia. So that was a really big part of my experience there, even though it wasn't actually, on the SAIS campus, but it was, part of my studies. So.
Did you do the research on that election of Gore and Bush?
No, it was Melanie. Did
Oh,
Melanie do that?
Melanie.
Melanie, my younger
That's
sister.
Dana's sister.
She
He's
helped.
not a SAIS. Just broke the mold there. The other professor I should mention too from Washington days was Herb Dinnerstein, who was my advisor, and yours. So that was we both specialized in Soviet area studies at the time, and he was a lot of help and wonderful teacher, and he was pretty instrumental in, I think, sort of making the contacts that led to my going to Indiana University for a PhD at the Russian and East European Institute there. So he knew Bernie Morris, who was at, I don't know if it's still that way, but he calls up Bernie Morris, hey, I've got this student you should look at. So, and next thing I know, I got a full scholarship ride.
Excellent.
Political science PhD program in Bloomington.
Excellent.
One course I really enjoyed was Admiralty Law with Philip Thayer, and that was in the summer session at Peterborough. And I've always had a hankering to continue studying Admiralty Law since then.
Well, that's excellent. Now, you also took Russian courses, is that right?
Yes, oh yes.
And was that your area of focus?
That was my area.
And as it was both of yours?
Mm-hmm.
And Dana, what did you focus on?
Well, conflict management, although you sort of, doing the MAI, you can't do an official concentration in conflict management, but I took all the courses and wrote my thesis in that area, so, but I don't think it comes out officially as being conflict management.
Great. Well,
most of the people in 48, or an awful lot, were studying Middle Eastern studies. There were more of them studying Middle East than Soviet. And,
which is
and
interesting,
studying
because the new SAIS
and they
team is from Iran.
all went with Aramco and other Middle Eastern oil enterprises.
Well, tell about what you're studying now, though. I mean, he has never quit studying.
Well, I'm studying Farsi now, but I started, my interest in Iran started with SAIS. For John Loftus's International Economic course, I did a paper on the oil of Iran. And ever since then, I've been dabbling around the edges on Iran and studying
But not
Farsi.
going inside.
I ended up renting an office from an Iranian family in northern Virginia.
Excellent. That's great. Yeah, I was just saying that the new dean of SAIS is from Iran.
I noticed
Yeah,
that.
yeah, it's really neat.
Was it
Yeah.
Nasser?
Yes, Ghali Nasser. Yeah. So that's neat. So why don't we, unless you're burning to tell another story, which you're welcome to, I was going to suggest maybe we talk a little bit about after graduating from SAIS, what are your memories, or what was your career trajectory, and tell us a little bit about what you did with the degree. Yeah.
Well, mine's probably the weirdest one to start with. Because Dave and I got married, and then he knew he wanted a PhD, so we went to the Russian East European Institute in Indiana. And I worked for about 6 months, and I thought, oh, I really my undergraduate degree at Stanford had been Russian history, so I got back into Russian history at Indiana University and was working in their PhD program as well. And I ended up getting ultimately a Fulbright and an IREX to go study in Russia. By that time we had Dana. She had her 3rd birthday in Moscow. It was 1978 we were there. And it was just a really incredible time. We were in Rostov-on-Don because that was the area that I was studying. I was studying the 1905 revolution from down there. It was a big railroad center, so they had kind of control of the whole Caucasus area and so on in terms of the revolution. So we were down there, and I just really got kind of involved in what life was like for people there, and how difficult it was. But one of the things that struck me a lot was it had been almost 50 years at that point since there had been, it had been atheist for 60 years. And yet, if you went to a church on a Sunday afternoon, you would see all of these elderly women bringing the children to be baptized. Which it just sort of blew my mind. And it was that they were old enough that there was nothing, they couldn't be harmed. If their parents tried to baptize the babies, they would lose passports, they might lose their job, they might lose whatever. But it really just struck me the kind of the sense that they had of their own kind of spirituality in the middle of all of that. And just kind of a very different sort of thing. But anyway, when I came back from that and was working on my dissertation, and then I got pregnant with her younger sister as well, and my interest started moving kind of in a slightly, well, actually a very different direction, because Dave was by then teaching political science at Butler, and Butler was connected to the Christian Theological Seminary because their religion department had become the seminary. So I could take courses there free. So I have a doctorate in ministry, and I ended up as a hospital chaplain.
Oh, wow.
So I ended up working in crises and relations, and in a lot of ways international relations, because it's people from all over everywhere. I worked for probably almost 20 years in the newborn intensive care with families there, and then also in the emergency room. And one of the things there too is, I was able to use my languages, because emergency rooms, we were getting people from all over the world. I remember one afternoon we had a patient whose only family was in France. So we had to call and try to, I was the only one who was there at that point who spoke any French at all, to try to convey to the family what was going on, and then to the patient kind of what was going on too.
Wow.
So I ended up on a very totally different level, but it wasn't that I didn't use what I had.
Of course.
Yeah. So.
And the SAIS degree is so sort of diverse that it teaches you skills that you can apply in many different ways.
Yes. Well, and a big piece of the Bologna experience is being with people from so many different backgrounds and so many different, so many different countries and cultures and all of that. And just getting a wider sense of humanity, and it served me well, just in a very different way.
Absolutely. Dana, what about you?
Well, when I graduated in 2003, it's not as bad as it is now in terms of job searching, but it wasn't great. A lot of us kind of had trouble, and so I spent a couple of years doing some things that weren't really related, to the SAIS degree, but kept looking. And so it took me 2 years to find the job that I have now at Resolve, and so I'm really glad to have found it, because it's exactly in the conflict resolution field. We do consensus building and facilitation on public policy and social issues, and at the time when I started here, that was back in 2006. It was pretty much focused on domestic issues. But now we've started to do more and more work internationally, which is like really exciting for me because that's what I've always wanted to work on. And in fact, right before this, I had a refresher French class. We're working, getting my vocabulary up to speed because I'm going to start doing some interviews with some stakeholders in Guinea and in the next couple of weeks, and probably we'll go to Paris for a meeting. So.
Excellent. So your French is that fluent?
Yeah, well, before I did
confident.
Yeah, well, before I did the SAIS degree, I lived in France for 4 years and did a degree at the institute, the Political Science Institute there, and that was all in French. So it's just a matter of getting back up to speed since that was a while ago.
But you know Spanish too, right?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I actually did also, and I studied Spanish at SAIS and did my, as I said, thesis in Colombia, so I spoke, Spanish there as well. But it's been a long time, and my Spanish is a lot rustier than my French.
You did mediation work with the court at one time?
Oh, right. I guess that's probably what helped me get the job here, is between SAIS and this Resolve job, I started volunteering at the DC Superior Court to do family mediation. And so that gave me some real, I had the class work and the coursework from SAIS, but I got the actual sort of hands-on experience doing mediation at the Superior Court in DC. So I think that helped me to get this job.
Excellent. That's super. That's great. Wow. Does your French and Spanish ever kind of
Oh yeah, and I speak because I lived in Bologna. I speak Italian too, or I did.
Yeah,
and
that's
so it's all.
excellent.
One of my French friends was making fun of me at one point, saying that I'm going to end up speaking Latin. Mishmash. But the French is I can pretty much keep the French separate because it's the strongest.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's terrific. And what about you, Richard? Tell us about your career trajectory.
I had planned to go in the Foreign Service, and I was preparing for the Foreign Service exams, but I had an English wife, and they would not let me take the exam until she'd gotten her citizenship. But by that time, Willis Armstrong had gotten me into the CIA, and so I stayed there for the next 24 years, focusing largely on the Soviet economy and also on international shipping and civil air. 24 years, I never had a dull day there.
I bet. And were you primarily in the Washington area, or did you
Primarily,
travel?
but because of my knowledge of Russian, they let me go to the operational side to do some projects for them. And I was used as an interpreter for 3 different U.S. exchange delegations with the USSR. The first one was a railway exchange, which was the first exchange, and which occurred 3 weeks after the U-2 had been shot down over Russia. So, we did not expect to receive a very warm welcome, but on the contrary, we found them very friendly, and we did 30 days travel around the East European Russia in railway cars, and at each station there was always a crowd to greet the delegation. Even if we weren't staying there, we'd stop there briefly for a couple minutes, and they'd all wave to us. So it was very gratifying to feel the warmth of the Russian people.
That's great. Now, you retired after 24 years, or did you? And when was that?
I took early retirement. They wanted to put me in charge of an African branch.
Okay.
And I didn't. I felt my talents were in another direction.
Okay. And
So
what have you done since then? Have you done any?
Well, my wife and I started a record firm importing dance music from Germany and England.
I knew there was something cool that was going to be.
And so we set up Telemark Dance Records, and we were the only firm for a while, and we after a while, we started producing our own records
Excellent.
using a British orchestra, and we did very well for many years, and I kept investing more and more money in LPs and the 45 singles, and then the CDs came along, and all this inventory was worthless. And by that time I was out of money, so I didn't have enough to invest in CDs.
But that's fun. What a fun career.
But
Yeah.
we're still. This is our 50th anniversary, and we have a very small online business.
That's great. Congratulations. Yeah. And what about you, Dave? Tell us a little bit about your career since you graduated.
Well, after SAIS, we went on to Bloomington, Indiana, where I did a PhD in political science and Russian and East European studies. And there, partly because of the introduction to the Eastern Europe course that I had from Calcini and Bologna, when we first got to Indiana, I started studying Polish, and that then became my area specialty. And I had several research grants, and we spent a lot of time in Poland over the years. And I wrote a couple of books about Poland and Eastern Europe. And right after I graduated from Indiana, I got a job at Butler University in Indianapolis, which was just up the road, thinking it was sort of a temporary job, but it turned out to suit us just fine. And I stayed there my whole career. So I was there for 33 years, just retiring 5 years ago.
That's terrific.
So I taught political science, international studies. I got involved in the core curriculum course and was the director of that. I was department head for a while. Did a lot of, meanwhile, kept going with research, and was the director for a long time of a big international research project called the International Social Justice Project, which was generated a lot of 2 books and hundreds of articles about social justice attitudes in 13 different countries.
Yeah, there were people from all those countries who were involved. Just because it was public opinion. I mean,
Right, it was public opinion. So in each country, each of these 13 countries, we had public opinion researchers who were sort of directing their part of it. And we would have our meetings. This project went on for a decade almost, and we'd have our meetings in the various capitals of the countries we were studying, and all over Eastern Europe, Japan, Canada, Bellagio, Italy. The Rockefeller Foundation hosted us a couple times. So
That's really neat.
You did an article on Romanian arms control. I've never forgotten that.
I did. That was one of my first articles. That came out of one of these NEH summer seminars that NEH ran for faculty members to explore an area of interest they hadn't done before. And it was a summer seminar basically on arms control issues, and I was looking at Romania as a case study of that.
You talk about your most recent book, though.
Yeah, my interests have gotten sort of broader and broader. And my first book was on Poland, then I wrote about Eastern Europe. I later wrote a textbook on modern Europe, which is still in print and use in quite a few universities. And then my most recent book, it's called The End of the American Century, which I published in 2008, and was arguing that the United States was sort of coming to the end of its era of affluence and dominance that it had enjoyed over the Cold War period, basically my whole career. And the book was published just before the economic collapse of 2008, 2009, but pretty much anticipated and predicted that. And I'm just now doing a kind of update of that, sort of reflections on what's happened since then. But I would say that not too much has changed overall, and I think
In terms of the projections, yeah.
And in terms of what I see as the U.S. sort of losing that stature and wealth and dominance it had for so long. But it's not, in my mind, it's not all negative, because I think both the United States and the world is better off without the United States quite so muscular as it was.
Well, that's great. Now,
How about
Yeah, go
the
ahead.
translation?
That was interesting. That book, The End of the American Century, was picked up and published in Chinese in Shanghai a couple years after it came out, and it attracted a lot of attention in China because one of the chapters in my book is about the rise of other powers, including China, and so the publisher and some academics in Shanghai invited me over to be there for a conference really focused on my book. And Sharon went with me, and that was quite an experience because we went, I gave this presentation with some other pretty prominent Chinese academics at a hall. It was kind of a Soviet-style conference hall. It was packed to the gills. It had thousands of people.
Yeah, it's incredible.
They had to pipe it into extra rooms for the spillover crowd. And it's very unlike when you give a lecture in this country. Academic and civil. So here I had sort of people coming up to me, wanting to have my picture taken with me, sign my pictures, sign my book, and I had to autograph hundreds, right? I mean, they sent me a box of my books, the Chinese version of the book, to my hotel room, right? I spent hours just signing them all that they were giving out to people. So,
And of course, they were simultaneously translating while he was talking. And then tell her about talking with the translator later. He wondered, whether they, that was going to be problematic, anything that he said,
Oh, right.
whether, Chinese censorship would be an issue or whatever. And we were having dinner a week later with the translator, and Dave said, well, how did you know that it was going to be, safe for you to be doing that? And he just laughed and he said, I knew that nobody else spoke English, so they just were going to take whatever he said.
that's great.
it reminded me of
And then India, is it translated in?
That's the Modern Europe book, my concise history of modern Europe.
In
Has
Hindi?
just been not translated, but republished by an Indian publishing house for the South Asian market.
In English. But,
In English.
Oh, okay,
So-
gotcha. Okay. Great. Well, yeah, no.
I was
go
just
ahead.
going to say, I don't know if you want to talk about semester at sea at all.
Oh,
That
yeah.
was another kind of neat.
Sure, you go ahead.
Oh, well, I mean, okay. So I guess when I was in 8th grade at the time, but for the first time, Dad decided, it was one of his sabbaticals, he decided to go and teach on this program Semester at Sea, which is floating university.
It's run by University of Pittsburgh at the time.
Uh-huh.
So they have, college level classes and so the program stops, and we stopped in 9 different countries. So the whole family went, and that's sort of one of the seminal moments, the big memories in my life. It was really a fantastic, amazing trip. You guys can probably talk about it more.
I mean, it's 100 days, literally sails all around the world. We started in Vancouver, sailed across the Pacific to Asia, and then ended up in Florida at the end. So
wow.
and you visit. For me, what was most enlightening was to visit some of these really poor countries, which most of my experience was Europe and Eastern Europe. And Eastern Europe always seemed sort of backward compared to, or less developed than Western Europe, but nothing like some of these other places, to Vietnam and Malaysia and India and others.
Yeah, it was really something to be, on a ship coming up the Mekong, with a ship full of kids who were college age, which was the age that we were when the war was going on, and just such very, very different sense it had for the adults, for all of us who were, the faculty families and so on. And for the kids, the college kids had no clue. It really meant nothing to them.
It was
It was
ancient
pretty
history for them.
overwhelming for us.
Yeah, that's really good.
Tell them about your project on the Mississippi River, the Missouri River.
The Missouri River Project is one of the projects that I work on here at Resolve, and it's sort of, I guess it kind of embodies a lot of the work that we do. It was designated by the Water Resources Development Act that the federal agencies that manage the Missouri River needed to create a multi-stakeholder committee to give them consensus advice on how to manage recovery actions on the Missouri River. So it's the Army Corps of Engineers manages the river, and then there's 3 endangered species that live along that river. And so this group of stakeholders ranging from states and tribes and people who have represent navigation interests or environmental interests all have to come to consensus on advice that they give to the agencies. So Resolve facilitates that group. That's one of our...
Are you going to do anything with the Potomac River? Which apparently on the news needs a lot of help.
Yes, maybe somebody will want to hire us.
They're experienced.
That's right. Well, why don't we thank you all for your stories. I'd like to sort of end this with your thoughts on current students today and looking at current students, given your illustrious careers. What advice might you have for a student today who's just graduating from SAIS? Anyone can start. I don't want to put anyone on the spot.
Well, while they're here in Washington, they should take advantage of all the public institutions we have, visit the Supreme Court and hearings in Congress. I remember the Jules Bingham class of 48, and I went to Congress and listened to the debate on the Marshall Plan, presided in the Senate, presided over by Alvin Barkley. And another thing is, be sure and do research in the Library of Congress, because that's a very rewarding experience.
Terrific. What about others?
Yeah, well, I would say that SAIS really is a great help for folks in finding jobs, because I know that we keep we have a kind of a regular email newsletter thing that goes from our crew, those that we were, especially those that we were with in Bologna and so on, but people in all different kinds of jobs who are, SAIS interested in SAIS students and know that they're going to be good students, It just seems to me there's a wealth of contacts out there in all kinds of different all kinds of different things that people have ended up doing with their international relations and with their languages and with so on. I hope that students really take advantage of the connections that SAIS gives. SAIS gives
network and then maintain those connections.
Yeah. Well, and we've met so many of Dana's SAIS friends. I mean, it's really been. They seem like a close group too.
Yeah, I have a close group of friends still from my SAIS. And then it's been 10 years now since my first SAIS Bologna year, so people are still close. But I guess I would say in terms of, I have talked to some recent grads, and specifically about the conflict resolution field, because it's quite a difficult field to get into. So the advice I have is just to try to get some experience in doing actual facilitation mediation. So as we mentioned before, I think my experience doing family mediation at the Superior Court was really, instrumental in finding a job in the field, because you don't necessarily at SAIS, you definitely get the academic background and so on, but you don't necessarily get a lot of the hands-on experience in conflict resolution, which I think is really important, because this programs are sort of blossoming everywhere now. So to really have something that sets you apart, it's important to try to do something like that.
And I would have said something similar in a more general sense, that, both reflecting what you both said, but, Washington's so well positioned. SAIS, right downtown in Washington, and there's so many opportunities for part-time jobs, summer jobs, internships, those sorts of things, and I think those are increasingly important for students to sort of get their foot in the water and start making contacts, and also to sort of figure out what it is you like and what it is you want to do. As an undergraduate, I never thought I would go into teaching. That wasn't on my radar. And I got to SAIS, and that just sparked my interest in Eastern Europe and those sorts of things. I just didn't want to stop studying, so I went on for a PhD, and then that's a sort of natural course of things. So, I think the more kinds of experiences you get, and especially in the real world, and this place is so well situated for that. The more you'll be able to sort of figure out where you want to go after that.
Terrific. Well, thank you all for your time. Thanks so much for all you've done for SAIS in the world, and I'm really glad that we could all come together today. Thanks.
Thank you.